Mason Reed never believed in ghosts. He believed in bad wiring, old foundations, sleep deprivation, paranoia, and the hundreds of logical explanations people created supernatural stories to avoid. That belief followed him all the way to Ashwood Lake. The town wasn't marked on most maps. It sat deep within northern Michigan, surrounded by endless forests and cold water that looked black even beneath the afternoon sun. The population barely reached 800. People came to Ashwood for one reason: to leave everything behind, which was exactly why Mason accepted the job. 3 months earlier, his life in Chicago had collapsed. The newspaper where he worked shut down. His apartment rent increased. His girlfriend left. By the beginning of October, he found himself unemployed and desperately searching for anything that paid enough to survive. Then he discovered the advertisement. Caretaker needed. Winter position. Ashwood Lake radio monitoring station. Housing included. Excellent pay. No experience required. The job sounded almost absurdly simple. An old radio station sat on a small island near the center of Ashwood Lake. The station no longer broadcasted. Decades earlier, it had been used by weather researchers and emergency communication teams. Now, it functioned as little more than a historical property. The caretaker's responsibility was to remain there through the winter, maintain equipment, and report any problems. 6 months, good money, free housing. Mason accepted immediately. Now standing on a weathered wooden dock beneath gray skies, he wondered if that had been a mistake. The boat arrived silently through thick fog. The driver looked nearly 70. His face was wrinkled like old leather. His eyes remained fixed on the water, neither friendly nor unfriendly, just distant. "You the new caretaker?" he asked. "Yeah," Mason replied. The old man nodded. "Get in." Mason loaded his bags. The boat pushed away from shore. For several minutes, they traveled in silence. The lake stretched endlessly around them. Cold mist drifted across the surface. Birds. No fish, no movement, only water. The silence felt wrong. Eventually, Mason spotted the island. It emerged from the fog like something hidden. Tall pine trees surrounded a massive building near the center. The structure looked older than the photographs. Much older. The main station tower rose nearly 4 stories high. Rust-covered metal supports. Broken antennas stretched toward the clouds. Dark windows reflected nothing. The place resembled an abandoned fortress. "Looks cheerful," Mason joked. The boat driver didn't smile. Instead, he asked a strange question. "Did they tell you about the radio?" Mason frowned. "What radio?" The old man stared ahead. "The one downstairs." Mason waited. The driver said nothing more. 5 minutes later, they reached the island. The boat touched the dock. Mason climbed out. The old man handed him a ring of keys. Then he spoke quietly. "Keep the basement locked after midnight." Mason laughed. "Why?" The old man finally looked directly at him. The expression in his eyes erased Mason's smile instantly. "Because if you hear voices, they're not talking to you." A moment later, the boat pulled away. The old man disappeared into the fog, leaving Mason alone. The island suddenly felt much larger and much colder. The station's interior surprised him. Dust covered everything, but the structure remained sturdy. Old offices lined the first floor. Storage rooms occupied the second. Living quarters sat on the third. The basement housed most of the original radio equipment. Generators, transmitters, control systems, miles of cables. The place was enormous. By evening, he felt comfortable, almost excited. The isolation appealed to him. No traffic, no neighbors, no constant noise, just silence. Pure silence. At least that's what he thought. The sound began around 11:47 p.m. A faint crackle, like static. Mason sat reading in the living quarters when he heard it. At first he ignored it. The building was old. Old buildings made sounds. Then the crackle grew louder. A soft hiss drifted through the ceiling. Static. Radio static. He looked up. The sound seemed to come from below, the basement. Mason sighed. Probably old equipment activating somehow. He grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The static became clearer with every step. Hiss. Crackle. Pop. Hiss. The noise echoed through the concrete corridor leading toward the equipment room. A steel door stood partially open. Light spilled from inside. Mason froze. He distinctly remembered turning everything off earlier. Every switch, every generator, everything. Yet light now glowed beneath the doorway. He approached carefully. The static intensified. The room beyond contained dozens of machines. Most remained dark, except one. An enormous radio console near the center. Green lights blinked across its surface. The speakers emitted a constant stream of static. Mason walked closer. The machine looked ancient, possibly from the 1960s. He examined the controls. Nothing appeared dangerous. Maybe an automatic backup system. Maybe faulty wiring. He reached toward the power switch, then froze. A sound emerged from the static. A voice, extremely faint, almost impossible to hear. A whisper. Mason leaned closer. The speaker crackled. Static filled the room. Then a single sentence emerged, clear as day. Mason. His blood turned cold. The voice knew his name. He jerked backward. The room became silent. Completely silent. No static. No whisper. Nothing. For several seconds, he simply stared. His rational mind immediately searched for explanations. Someone could be pranking him. Maybe local teenagers. Maybe the station received random signals. Maybe a loud metallic bang interrupted his thoughts. The sound came from somewhere upstairs. Mason spun around. Silence followed. Then another bang, much closer. Something had fallen or moved. He grabbed the flashlight and hurried upstairs. The building appeared empty. Every room remained exactly as before. No intruders, no animals, no explanation. Eventually he returned to bed. Sleep proved impossible. The whisper repeated endlessly inside his head. Mason. Not hello, not help, just his name. As though someone had recognized him. As though someone already knew he was there. The next morning he drove into town. Ashwood contained little more than a diner, gas station, hardware store, and church. The diner seemed the most promising place for information. Inside, locals occupied nearly every table. When Mason entered, several people stared. Not hostile, just curious. The new caretaker. News apparently traveled fast. Mason ordered coffee and breakfast. An elderly waitress served him. Her name tag read, Helen. You staying on the island? Yeah. Helen nodded slowly. Long winter. So people keep telling me. She hesitated, then asked, Did you hear anything last night? Mason nearly dropped his coffee. What do you mean? Helen looked uncomfortable. Nothing. He studied her. You know something. The waitress glanced toward the other customers. Several appeared to be listening. Finally, she lowered her voice. The station's been empty for years. Okay? Most caretakers don't stay long. Mason frowned. What happened to them? Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the windows, toward the distant lake. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded uneasy. They leave. That's it? Usually. Usually? Helen swallowed, then whispered, the last one disappeared. Silence filled the space between them. Mason stared. What do you mean, disappeared? No one knows. What was his name? Helen shook her head. I don't remember. The answer sounded false, like she remembered perfectly, but didn't want to say it. The conversation ended there. Every attempt to ask more questions failed. Locals suddenly became busy, or silent. Nobody wanted to discuss the station. Nobody wanted to discuss the island. and absolutely nobody wanted to discuss the basement radio. 3 nights later, the whispers returned. This time at exactly 11:47 p.m. The same moment, the same static, the same radio. Mason waited upstairs as the sound echoed through the building. Hiss. Crackle. Pop. Hiss. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. He descended into the basement. The radio glowed once again. Green lights flickered across the console. Static poured from the speakers. Mason approached slowly. The voice emerged almost immediately. Mason. He froze. The whispers sounded different. Closer, stronger, almost human. "Who's there?" he demanded. Static. Then another whisper. "Don't answer." Mason blinked. "What?" The speaker crackled violently. The voice repeated, "Don't answer." A second voice suddenly erupted from the radio, louder, angrier. "Mason!" The room shook. Static exploded from every speaker. Mason stumbled backward, then silence returned. Complete silence. His heart pounded violently. For several moments he couldn't move. 2 voices, one calling him, one warning him. Neither explained anything. Neither sounded remotely normal. Then he noticed something. The radio screen displayed coordinates, numbers, latitude and longitude, a location. The coordinates blinked repeatedly. Mason copied them onto paper. When he later checked a map, his stomach tightened. The coordinates pointed directly toward the center of Ashwood Lake. Not the island, the lake itself, specifically a location nearly half a mile from shore. A point over open water, a point where absolutely nothing existed, or at least nothing visible. The next day, Mason rented a small fishing boat. Despite worsening weather, he traveled toward the coordinates. The lake remained unnaturally calm. Fog drifted across the surface. The air felt colder than before. As he approached the location, his GPS confirmed it. Exact match. He arrived directly above the coordinates. Nothing surrounded him, only water. Endless black water. Mason sighed. Maybe the radio was malfunctioning after all. Maybe, thunk. The boat jolted. Something hit the underside. Mason looked down. The water beneath him appeared darker, much darker, almost like a shadow. Then another impact struck the hull. Thunk. This time harder. Mason leaned over carefully. The lake's surface rippled. For one horrifying second, he thought he saw something moving below. Something enormous. Something pale. A shape far beneath the water. Then it vanished. The lake returned to normal. Mason's pulse accelerated. He started the engine immediately. The boat turned toward shore. Halfway back, the radio on board crackled unexpectedly. Static erupted from the speaker. Then a voice whispered. A voice identical to the one in the station basement. "Mason." He nearly dropped the controls. The voice continued. Slow, weak, terrified. "Don't let it hear you." The radio died. Silence returned. Mason stared at the lake, the fog, the island waiting ahead. For the first time since arriving, he felt genuine fear. Because the voice hadn't sounded threatening, it had sounded frightened, terrified, as if something beneath Ashwood Lake was listening. And whatever it was, it had finally noticed him. Mason did not sleep that night. The voice from the boat radio replayed in his mind over and over. "Don't let it hear you." Those 4 words disturbed him more than the whispers themselves. A prank made sense. Faulty equipment made sense. Even some bizarre radio interference made sense. But fear was harder to explain. The voice had sounded genuinely terrified. Not angry, not threatening, terrified. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, he found himself standing at the third-floor window, overlooking Ashwood Lake. The island was surrounded by darkness. Clouds covered the moon. Fog drifted slowly across the water. Everything appeared still, silent, dead. Then he noticed a light, far away, near the middle of the lake. A single white light. It hovered above the water, motionless. Mason frowned. No boats should have been out there this late, especially not in weather like this. The light remained perfectly still. 5 minutes passed, 10. It never moved. Then, suddenly, it vanished. Not faded, vanished. 1 second it existed, the next second, it was gone. Mason stared into the darkness. Nothing remained, only black water. A chill crawled across his spine. Eventually, he stepped away from the window. As he turned toward the hallway, he heard something below him. A sound. Footsteps. Slow footsteps. Walking across the second floor. Mason froze. The station should have been empty. He listened carefully. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy footsteps. Someone was walking downstairs. His heartbeat accelerated. He grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the stairwell. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, as though someone wandered through the building. The sound led him down to the second floor, then suddenly stopped. Silence returned. Mason swept the flashlight across the hallway. Nothing. Empty rooms. Dust-covered furniture. Broken filing cabinets. No people. No animals. No explanation. He moved cautiously through every room. Nothing. The station remained empty. Yet he knew what he had heard. Someone had been walking. Someone heavy. Someone close. After 20 minutes of searching, he returned toward the stairs. Then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Fresh footprints in the dust. Large footprints. Human footprints. They stretched down the hallway, appearing from nowhere. There were no tracks leading into the hallway, only tracks moving through it, as though someone had materialized in the middle of the building. The footprints ended outside an old storage room. Mason slowly opened the door. The room was empty, except for one object. An old photograph lying on the floor. He stared at it. The photo appeared decades old, black and white. Several men stood in front of the radio station. Workers, technicians, researchers. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Mason noticed one face, a man standing near the center. Tall, dark hair, serious expression. His breath caught. The man looked exactly like him. Not similar, not close. Exactly. Same face, same eyes, same features. Mason dropped the photograph. A cold wave passed through him. That was impossible. The image had to be old, at least 50 years old, yet the man in the picture looked like his twin. For several moments, he simply stared. Then another detail caught his attention. Written across the back of the photograph were 3 words. He answered back. Nothing else. No date, no names, just those words. Mason suddenly wanted sunlight, fresh air, anything away from that building. He grabbed the photo and hurried upstairs. The rest of the night passed without incident, but sleep never came. The next morning he returned to town. This time he headed directly toward the small historical society building near the church. The place looked ancient. Dust covered nearly every shelf. Old newspapers filled metal cabinets. Photographs lined the walls. An elderly man sat behind a desk reading. His name tag identified him as Walter. When Mason showed him the photograph, the man's expression immediately changed. The color drained from his face. "Where did you get this?" Inside the station. Walter stared at the image. His hands trembled slightly. "I haven't seen this photograph in years." "Who are these people?" The old man hesitated, then sighed. "Station workers." "What's the station's history?" Walter remained silent for a long moment. Finally he spoke. The government built it in 1968. Why? Officially? Sure. Weather monitoring. Mason raised an eyebrow. And unofficially? Walter looked around to ensure nobody else was listening, then lowered his voice. Signal research. What kind of signal? No one knows. Mason sat down. Walter continued. The station received transmissions that weren't supposed to exist. What does that mean? Messages. What kind of messages? The old man swallowed. Voices. Mason felt his pulse quicken. Walter leaned closer. The signals came from beneath the lake. Silence filled the room. Mason remembered the coordinates. The pale shape underwater. The whispers. Suddenly none of it seemed random anymore. The voices came from underwater? Walter nodded. That's what workers reported. What happened? The old man looked uncomfortable. People started disappearing. Mason said nothing. Walter continued. At first they blamed accidents. Then they found recordings. What recordings? The old man's voice became almost a whisper. Conversations. Mason frowned. Between who? Walter stared directly into his eyes. Between station workers and themselves. The room became silent. Mason didn't understand. What do you mean themselves? Walter swallowed. The recordings contained two voices. Mason felt a knot form in his stomach. The workers? Walter nodded, and something that sounded exactly like them. An hour later, Mason left with a box of copied documents. Technical information. Signal frequencies. Maintenance reports. Equipment logs. Nothing unusual. Then he discovered a report dated November 14, 1974. The document described an incident involving a technician named Eric Nolan. Mason read every word. According to the report, Eric had been monitoring radio traffic shortly before midnight. At exactly 11:47 p.m., a signal appeared. A voice emerged from the static. The voice sounded identical to Eric. The signal claimed to be trapped. It begged for help. It begged to be released. Eric reportedly spent 3 weeks communicating with it. Then, he disappeared. No trace was ever found. The final sentence disturbed Mason most. Witnesses reported hearing two versions of Eric speaking simultaneously on the night he vanished. One voice came from inside the station, the other came from the lake. Mason closed the folder. His hands felt cold. The similarities were impossible to ignore. He had heard voices. He had heard his own name. And every encounter occurred at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time mentioned throughout the reports. Whatever happened in Ashwood Lake wasn't new. It had been happening for decades. That evening, a storm arrived. Powerful winds battered the island. Rain hammered against the windows. Thunder rolled across the lake. Mason spent hours reading documents. Every report painted the same picture. Voices, static, disappearances, fear. By 11:30 p.m., he sat in the basement. This time, he intended to record everything. A digital recorder rested beside him. A camera pointed toward the radio. He would finally gather proof. 11:45. 11:46. Silence. Then the radio lights activated. Green illumination filled the room. Static burst from the speakers. Hiss, crackle, pop. Mason switched on the recorder. The static intensified. A voice emerged. Mason. His pulse accelerated. The voice sounded clearer than ever before. Almost human. Almost alive. "What are you?" Mason asked. Silence. Then the voice answered. A single sentence. "I am you." The room seemed to grow colder. Mason stared at the radio. "What does that mean?" Static crackled. Then came the reply. "The lake remembers." Mason felt confused. What lake? The voice ignored the question. Instead, it spoke again. "You should leave." The fear in its tone sounded genuine. Then another voice erupted from the speaker. Deep, harsh, violent. A voice Mason had never heard before. "Mason, The sound shook the room. Every light flickered. The radio screamed with static. Mason covered his ears. The deep voice continued. "Come closer." The words seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls. Not merely sound, something physical, something alive. The first voice returned immediately. Panicked, desperate. "Don't listen. Mason, don't answer. Mason, don't answer. Mason." The voices overlapped, arguing, competing. The static became deafening. Suddenly, every monitor in the room activated. Screens flickered to life. Images appeared. Mason's blood froze. The monitors displayed Ashwood Lake. Dozens of camera angles. Different years, different seasons, different weather. Yet the same location. The center of the lake. The coordinates. Something existed there. Something enormous. The blurry images revealed a shape beneath the water. Far below the surface, massive, circular, moving, watching. The storm outside intensified. Thunder exploded overhead. The screens continued flashing, image after image, year after year. The shape remained present in every photograph, always there, always beneath the lake, as though it had never left, as though it had always been waiting. Then one monitor changed. The image showed a man standing on the island dock. Dark hair, blue jacket, 30 years old. Mason recognized him immediately. The previous caretaker, the missing one. The man turned toward the camera. His face looked terrified. Then something happened. A second version of the man stepped out from behind him. Identical, perfectly identical. The two stared at each other. The footage abruptly ended. Static consumed the screen. Mason stumbled backward. His breathing became rapid. The room suddenly felt wrong, dangerous, predatory. The deep voice returned. Closer this time, much closer, almost beside him. "You hear us now?" Mason spun around. Nobody stood there. The room remained empty. Yet he could feel a presence. Something unseen. Something near. The radio lights flashed violently. The first voice screamed. Not spoke, screamed. Every light exploded. Darkness consumed the room. The radio died instantly. Silence followed. Complete silence. For several seconds, Mason remained frozen. Then he heard movement. Not from the radio. Not from upstairs. From outside. Near the shoreline. Something large had emerged from the water. He could hear it. Slow, wet impacts. Heavy dragging sounds. As though an enormous body crawled across the island. Mason switched on his flashlight. His hands trembled. The beam cut through darkness. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet the sounds continued. Closer, closer, closer. Then came footsteps. Massive footsteps, circling the building. The walls vibrated with each step. Mason's heart hammered. The thing outside sounded enormous. Far larger than any human. Far larger than any animal. Thunder flashed. For a brief moment, white light illuminated a window. Mason looked and saw a silhouette standing outside. 4 stories tall. Impossible. Its shape resembled a human figure, but stretched, distorted, wrong. The head tilted unnaturally. Long arms hung beside its body. The figure remained motionless, watching the station, watching him. Then darkness returned. The silhouette disappeared. Mason backed away from the window. Fear, unlike anything he had ever experienced, flooded through him. Every instinct screamed the same warning. Leave, immediately. But before he could move, a sound echoed from somewhere above. A door opening, slowly, creak. Then footsteps. Inside the building, heavy footsteps, walking down from the 3rd floor. Not outside, inside. Mason raised the flashlight. The stairwell stood at the end of the hallway. Dark, silent, The footsteps continued. Thump, thump, thump. Something was coming downstairs, and whatever had entered the station, it sounded exactly like him. The footsteps continued. Slow, measured, deliberate. Mason stood frozen in the basement hallway, flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound came from above, from the third floor, from the living quarters. Something was descending the stairs. Something heavy. Something that walked like a human, yet every instinct inside him screamed that it wasn't human at all. Another step echoed. Closer. Mason forced himself to move. He hurried toward the basement stairs. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across concrete walls. The footsteps continued. Thump, thump, thump. The thing wasn't rushing. It wasn't chasing him. It seemed confident, like it knew there was nowhere to run. Mason reached the first floor and immediately stopped. The front entrance stood open. Cold wind howled through the doorway. Rain blew across the floor. He distinctly remembered locking that door earlier. Now it hung wide open. Something had entered, or something had left. Lightning flashed outside. For a fraction of a second, the island appeared in brilliant white light. Mason looked toward the dock. A figure stood there, motionless, watching the station. The distance made details impossible to see, but the shape looked familiar. Too familiar. Then darkness swallowed everything again. The figure vanished. Another step echoed behind him. Inside the building, Mason spun around. The stairwell remained empty, yet the footsteps continued, descending, floor by floor, coming closer. Suddenly a voice drifted through the darkness, identical to his own. Mason. His blood froze. The voice sounded perfect. Every tone, every inflection, exactly his. Mason, come upstairs. He backed away. The voice spoke again. Please. The fear in the voice sounded real. Painful, desperate, like someone begging for help. Yet Mason remembered the reports, the station workers, the recordings, the duplicate voices. Whatever spoke upstairs wasn't him, and it certainly wasn't human. The voice continued. You left me here. Lightning flashed again. For an instant, Mason thought he saw movement at the top of the staircase. A silhouette, a man standing there. Then darkness returned. The figure disappeared. Mason turned and ran. The storm raged throughout the night. Mason barricaded himself inside an old office on the second floor. A heavy desk blocked the door. Several filing cabinets reinforced it. Every light remained off. He sat in darkness listening. The thing moved through the station for hours. Footsteps echoed in distant hallways. Doors opened and closed. Sometimes he heard whispering. Sometimes laughter. Occasionally his own voice, speaking from somewhere beyond the walls. Around 3 a.m. he heard knocking. 3 slow knocks against the office door. Knock, knock, knock. Silence followed. Then his own voice emerged from the hallway. Mason. He didn't answer. The voice continued. I know you're inside. Another knock. Knock. You need to listen. Knock. It's coming. Mason squeezed his eyes shut. The voice sounded so convincing, so real. For a moment, he almost believed it. Then he remembered the warning. Don't answer. The first voice from the radio had repeated those words again and again. Don't answer. So he remained silent. The knocking continued for nearly 10 minutes, then abruptly stopped. The rest of the night passed without incident. At dawn, the station became quiet. Too quiet. The next morning, Mason discovered something terrifying. The office door contained scratches. Hundreds of scratches. deep grooves carved into solid wood, as though something with enormous claws had dragged them across the surface. Yet the thing outside had spoken with a human voice. The contradiction made no sense. Neither did Ashwood Lake. Neither did the station. Nothing made sense anymore. He spent the morning reviewing the documents he had copied from the Historical Society. Most seemed useless, until he found a folder labeled Incident 47. The folder appeared older than the others, much older. The pages were yellow with age. Several photographs accompanied the report. Mason began reading. The first page was dated 1979. According to the report, researchers discovered unusual radio frequencies beneath Ashwood Lake. The signals didn't originate from satellites, or military equipment, or natural phenomena. They originated from somewhere beneath the lake itself. Researchers initially believed an underground geological formation caused the transmissions. Then divers were sent underwater. The divers never returned. A second team followed. Only one diver survived. His testimony filled 6 pages. The diver claimed the lake contained a structure. Not a cave, not a rock formation, a structure. Something artificial, something enormous, located nearly 600 feet below the surface. The structure resembled a circle, miles wide, covered with symbols. The diver claimed he heard voices while underwater. Thousands of voices, all speaking simultaneously. The report stated he suffered a complete psychological breakdown shortly afterward. Most officials dismissed his claims, yet the station remained active. The monitoring continued, year after year, until the disappearances began. Then Mason reached the final page. The final page contained a single sentence highlighted in red. The signal does not imitate people, it replaces them. Mason stared at the words. A cold sensation spread through his chest. Replaces them, not imitates, replaces. Suddenly he remembered the footage. The previous caretaker standing beside his duplicate. 2 identical versions of the same man. Which one had been real? The report implied a horrifying possibility. Maybe only one had left the island. That afternoon, Mason returned to town. This time he searched for Walter. The old historian listened carefully as Mason described everything. The voices, the footage, the documents, the silhouette outside. Walter looked increasingly frightened. Finally he stood and locked the office door. Then he spoke quietly. "You're seeing what the others saw." The others? The caretakers. Mason frowned. How many disappeared? Walter hesitated. Officially, sure, and unofficially. Walter looked away. 12. The room fell silent. Mason felt sick. 12 people vanished? Walter nodded. Over the years. Nobody investigated? They did. What happened? Walter laughed bitterly. The investigators started hearing voices too. Mason said nothing. Walter leaned closer. Do you know why the station remained open? No, because they couldn't destroy it. A chill ran through Mason. What do you mean? They tried. Walter's face turned pale. They demolished the tower in 1988. Mason blinked. What? Walter nodded. They brought in explosives. Then why is it still standing? The old man swallowed. Because the next morning it was back. Mason stared. That's impossible. I know. Walter's eyes looked haunted. But dozens of people saw it. The station had supposedly been destroyed, yet somehow returned. Standing exactly where it had before. Unchanged, undamaged, as though nothing had happened. Walter opened a drawer. Inside rested a newspaper clipping. Mason examined it. The article contained photographs, explosions, fire, collapsed metal, destroyed concrete. The station clearly lay in ruins. Then a second photograph showed the same location 24 hours later. The station stood untouched, perfectly intact. Mason felt dizzy. The article couldn't be real, yet the images looked authentic. Everything about Ashwood Lake seemed to violate reality itself. Walter suddenly grabbed his arm. Mason. What? You need to leave. I tried. No. Walter shook his head. You need to leave now. Mason frowned. Why? The old man's face drained of color. Slowly he pointed behind Mason, toward the window. Mason turned. Outside the Historical Society building stood a man. A tall man. Dark hair, blue jacket. His own face stared back at him. The duplicate smiled, then walked away. Mason ran outside immediately. The street appeared empty. No sign of the man. No footprints. Nothing. People nearby acted normal. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual. Yet Mason knew what he had seen. The duplicate had left the island, which meant it wasn't confined to the station, or the lake, or the forest. It could go anywhere. That realization terrified him more than anything else. He returned to the island before sunset. A thick fog covered the water. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. The atmosphere felt oppressive, heavy, as though the lake itself watched him. When he arrived at the dock, he discovered something strange. Fresh footprints, dozens of them, leading from the shoreline toward the station. All identical, all the same size, the same shape, his shape. Hundreds of footprints made by hundreds of versions of him. The trail vanished into the fog. Mason's pulse raced. He hurried inside, closed every curtain, then waited. Night arrived quickly. The storm returned. Rain hammered the windows. Thunder shook the station. At 11:30 p.m., the power failed. Darkness consumed the building. Mason switched on a flashlight. The beam illuminated floating dust particles. Nothing else. Silence filled the station. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then every radio activated simultaneously. Static exploded throughout the building. Dozens of speakers crackled at once. Hiss, crackle, pop, hiss. The sound echoed from every room, every floor, every hallway. The entire station seemed alive. Then came the voices. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once, all using Mason's voice. The noise became overwhelming. The building shook. Walls vibrated. Windows rattled violently. Mason covered his ears. The voices continued. Thousands, maybe millions, all saying the same thing. Come down, come down, come down, come down. The words repeated endlessly. Then every radio abruptly fell silent. A single voice emerged. The frightened voice. The one that had warned him before. Mason. He froze. The voice sounded weaker than ever. Exhausted. Dying. You have to find the door. What door? Mason whispered. The radio crackled. The one beneath the lake. His heart pounded. What are you? Then, the answer came. A single sentence. One that changed everything. I was the caretaker before you. Mason's blood ran cold. The missing caretaker. The voice belonged to him, or what remained of him. The radio continued. It copied me. Mason struggled to breathe. It copies everyone. Static interrupted. Then the voice returned, more desperate than ever. It isn't a ghost. What is it? The answer arrived through a wall of static. Something ancient. Something impossible. Something terrifying. It is dreaming. Mason frowned. What? The voice continued. The thing below the lake. Static. The structure. Static. The signal. It's asleep. Mason's pulse accelerated. The station trembled. The voice became frantic. And every time someone hears it, a thunderous boom shook the building. The radio screamed. Lights flashed. Windows shattered. The voice shouted one final sentence. It dreams them into existence. The transmission died. Silence followed. Complete silence. Then something struck the station from outside. The impact nearly knocked Mason off his feet. Another impact followed. Then another. The entire building shook violently, as though something enormous battered the walls. Lightning flashed across the sky. For a split second, Mason looked outside and saw them. Hundreds of figures standing around the station. Every single one wore his face. Every single one stared directly at him, smiling, motionless, waiting. And beyond them, standing in the lake itself, rose a shape so enormous that it disappeared into the storm clouds above. Watching, awakening. The thing in the lake moved. For the first time since arriving in Ashwood, Mason witnessed it clearly. Lightning illuminated the storm. A colossal silhouette towered above the water. Its shape barely resembled anything human. It appeared formed from darkness itself. Long limbs stretched across the lake. Its head disappeared into the clouds, and all around the shoreline stood hundreds of copies of Mason. Perfect copies. Each wore the same clothes, the same face, the same expression. Smiling, watching, waiting. Then every duplicate spoke simultaneously. "We found you." The voices shook the station. Mason stumbled backward. Every survival instinct screamed one command: run. But there was nowhere to go. The island was surrounded by water. The dock was blocked. The forest offered no protection, and whatever lived beneath Ashwood Lake seemed to control everything around it. Then, a familiar sound emerged. Static. The basement radio had activated again. The frightened voice returned. "Mason." He rushed downstairs. The radio lights flickered weakly. Unlike before, the voice sounded exhausted, as if it had little time remaining. "They're coming. I know." "No," the voice crackled. "You don't understand." The transmission struggled. It finally woke up. A chill spread through Mason. "What woke up?" The voice answered. "The dreamer." Silence followed. Outside, thunder exploded. The station trembled. The frightened voice continued. "For thousands of years it slept beneath the lake. What is it? No one knows." Static filled the room. "But it dreams." Mason remembered the warning. "It dreams them into existence." The realization slowly formed inside his mind. The duplicates, the station, the voices, the impossible events. All of them were manifestations, creations, dreams. The voice continued. "When people hear the signal, the dreamer notices them." Mason felt cold. "And then, it begins creating copies." "Why?" No answer came immediately. Then the voice whispered, "Because it wants to wake up." The lights flickered. The radio crackled violently. The copies replaced the originals. Mason swallowed. "What happens to the originals?" Several seconds passed. Then came the answer. They become part of the dream. Fear settled deep inside him. The missing caretakers, the divers, the researchers, all absorbed into whatever existed beneath the lake. The radio suddenly emitted a burst of static. The voice returned one final time. "There is still a way." Mason leaned closer. "Tell me." "The transmitter." "What about it?" The original transmitter created the connection. "The one in the basement?" "No." Static surged. "The one below the lake." Mason froze. "The structure. The ancient circular structure beneath Ashwood Lake. The signal comes from there." The voice sounded weaker. "If you destroy the connection, the dreamer stops?" "No." The answer came immediately. "Nothing can stop it." Mason's heart sank. "But you can put it back to sleep." Outside, the station shook violently. Glass shattered somewhere upstairs. The copies were entering. The voice spoke rapidly. "The old maintenance tunnel." "What tunnel?" "Beneath the basement." Mason frowned. "There is." The radio hissed. "Behind the northern wall." Static intensified. "You don't have much time." The transmission suddenly vanished. Silence returned. The radio went dark, forever. A crash echoed above. Then another. The copies had entered the building. Mason grabbed a flashlight. He ran toward the northern basement wall. At first he saw nothing, only concrete, old pipes, dust. Then he noticed a rusted metal panel hidden behind storage shelves. He pulled it away. A narrow steel door appeared. His pulse accelerated. The voice had been telling the truth. The door groaned open. Cold air rushed outward. A staircase descended into darkness. Mason entered. The door slammed shut behind him. The tunnel stretched downward for what felt like miles. Concrete eventually gave way to stone. Ancient stone. Walls covered with symbols. Symbols unlike any language he had ever seen. The deeper he traveled, the colder the air became. Then he heard something. Whispers. Thousands of whispers. Not from ahead, not from behind. The stone seemed alive. Breathing. Listening. Watching. Eventually the tunnel ended. Mason emerged into a vast underground chamber. His flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. The cavern was enormous. Far larger than the station. Far larger than the island. At its center stood the structure. The same structure described by the diver decades earlier. A colossal circular object. Miles old. Possibly older than human civilization. Its surface pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, like something sleeping. Around it stood thousands of figures, human figures, motionless, silent, frozen in place. Mason's stomach turned. They weren't statues, they were people, researchers, divers, caretakers, men, women, children, generations of missing victims, all standing perfectly still, eyes open, expressions empty, part of the dream. Then he saw one face, the previous caretaker, the owner of the frightened voice. The man stood motionless among the others. His eyes met Mason's. For a brief second they moved, just slightly. The man smiled sadly, then became still again. Mason felt sick. The victims weren't dead. Not entirely. They remained trapped, somewhere between existence and dream. Then a sound echoed through the chamber. Footsteps. Hundreds of footsteps. Mason turned. The duplicates had arrived. They emerged from every tunnel entrance, thousands of them. Every face belonged to him. The copies surrounded the chamber, smiling, watching, waiting. One stepped forward. Unlike the others, this one spoke alone. "We were wondering when you'd arrive." Mason backed away. "What are you?" The duplicate smiled wider. "We are what remains." "Of who?" "You." The answer echoed throughout the cavern. Thousands of identical voices repeating the same word. "You, you, you, you." The sound became overwhelming. The duplicate pointed toward the structure. "The dreamer saw you." Mason felt terror creeping into his chest. "And now it dreams you." The structure pulsed again. A deep vibration shook the chamber. Suddenly, Mason saw images. Not with his eyes, inside his mind. Cities, civilizations, ancient oceans, creatures unlike anything human. Millions of years passing. The dreamer sleeping beneath the earth, dreaming endlessly, creating worlds, creating life, creating memories, creating reality itself. The vision vanished. Mason staggered. The duplicate stepped closer. "It dreamed us all." The structure pulsed again. A low hum filled the cavern. Mason suddenly understood. The dreamer wasn't merely creating copies. It was creating reality. The station, the lake, the town, perhaps even humanity. All part of an endless dream. And now it was waking. The chamber began shaking violently. Cracks spread across the ceiling. The structure glowed brighter. The dreamer was awakening. If it woke completely, Mason somehow knew reality itself would unravel. The copies began walking toward him. thousands of them. Slowly, patiently. There was nowhere left to run. Then he noticed something. Near the base of the structure stood an old machine, a transmitter. Ancient cables connected it directly to the circular object. The connection, the signal, the thing keeping the dreamer linked to the world above. Mason ran. The duplicates immediately reacted. Their smiles vanished. For the first time, they looked afraid. The nearest copies lunged toward him. Mason dodged them. More rushed forward. He reached the transmitter. The machine looked impossibly old. Rust covered every surface, yet it still functioned, still transmitted, still connected. The duplicates screamed, not in anger, in panic. Mason grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, then swung with all his strength. The transmitter cracked. A burst of static exploded outward. The entire chamber shook. The dreamer pulsed violently. The duplicates froze. Mason struck again, and again, and again. Metal twisted. Cables snapped. Static filled the air. The copies began dissolving, their bodies breaking apart into black smoke. The nearest duplicate looked directly at him. Its expression no longer hateful, only frightened. Please don't. Mason swung again. The transmitter shattered. Everything stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. The structure emitted one final pulse, a pulse so powerful it knocked Mason to the ground. The chamber went dark. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the sleeping figures began moving. Researchers, divers, caretakers, victims from decades past. One by one, they opened their eyes, awakened, freed. The previous caretaker smiled, then slowly faded into light. Others followed, thousands of trapped souls disappearing peacefully, leaving only darkness behind. The dreamer had returned to sleep. Mason woke on a hospital bed 3 days later. Doctors found him unconscious on the shoreline of Ashwood Lake. The station was gone, completely gone. Not destroyed, gone. The island contained only trees, no tower, no building, no radio equipment, nothing. Authorities searched extensively. They found no evidence the station had ever existed. No foundation, no debris, nothing. Even the historical records disappeared. Newspaper articles vanished. Photographs vanished. Documents vanished. It was as if the station had never been real. Walter remembered nothing. The townspeople remembered nothing. Nobody remembered Ashwood Lake radio monitoring station, except Mason. Months later, he moved back to Chicago. Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as possible. He never spoke publicly about what happened. No one would believe him anyway. Sometimes he almost convinced himself it had been a hallucination, a breakdown, a nightmare. Then came the final reminder. One cold October night, nearly a year later, Mason woke suddenly at exactly 11:47 p.m. His apartment was silent, dark. Then he heard it. Very faint, barely audible. Static. Hiss. Crackle. Pop. Hiss. The sound drifted from somewhere inside the walls. Mason sat motionless, listening. Then a familiar voice whispered through the darkness. Not threatening, not angry, just distant, ancient, awake. Mason, the static continued. And somewhere far beneath the world, something was dreaming again.